A sense of panic is sweeping Moscow. What was once whispered is now starting to come out into the open. Russians are being hinted that autumn could turn into a real nightmare, and the Kremlin is finding it harder to hide its nervousness. Propagandists are suddenly talking about vacations abroad, elites about ending the war, and millions of Russians are looking not for news of victory, but for its end date. Is the system finally collapsing? We'll talk about that right now. Greetings, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafonova with the latest events. In Russia, people are now advised to prepare not for victories, but for unpleasant surprises. And this time, the alarming forecasts aren't coming from Western analysts or Ukrainian experts, but from representatives of the Russian information space itself. Z-blogger Ilya Remeslo suddenly came out with some rather unusual advice for his fellow citizens. He effectively suggested that Russians consider taking a long vacation abroad this autumn. The reason is simple. According to him, after the elections in Russia, events could begin that many will remember for the rest of their lives. Most interestingly, among the possible scenarios, he listed things quite different from what Russian propaganda is used to hearing. His forecasts include problems at the front, an internal crisis, new upheavals around Crimea, and even scenarios where the authorities might return to the issue of large-scale mobilization.
If you want to fully protect yourself from mobilization and other crises, take a long vacation abroad starting in mid-September, right after the elections, for 2 to 3 months. By December, all of this should be over.
Just yesterday, Russians were being assured that everything was going according to plan, the economy was stable, and the situation was under full control. But today, some government supporters are already advising people to sit out the autumn abroad just in case. Alarm bells are ringing louder and louder in the Kremlin. The economic elites closest to Putin are already openly talking about the need to end the war, while Russians themselves are searching for information about bomb shelters, drones, and the end of the SVO at record rates. And while Ukrainian technologies are opening a new stage of the war, more and more people in Russia are starting to ask the question that the Kremlin has long avoided answering. All the details are in our report. In the Kremlin, what Putin fears most is being heard more and more often: talk of ending the war. And this time, it wasn't an oppositionist, an independent expert, or even a Western politician who spoke up. The head of Russia's largest bank, Herman Gref, a man who has been part of the Russian president's inner economic circle for many years, publicly stated the need for a swifter end to the war.
I don't think there's a person in the country who has any other concerns besides the swiftest possible conclusion of military actions.
Gref effectively admitted what is being whispered more and more often in Moscow. And if the head of Sberbank allows himself to make such statements publicly, it may indicate much deeper sentiments within the Russian elites. The reaction to this phrase turned out to be even more telling. The message with the quote vanished from news outlets almost immediately, then just as unexpectedly, it reappeared. It seems that in Moscow, they can't even decide anymore which signals are allowed to be sent to the public and which are not. When a country starts nervously editing the words of one of its most influential officials just a minute after publication, it usually signals internal tension. And it looks like this is where the most dangerous trend for the dictator is beginning to take shape. Because when it's not ordinary citizens but people from the inner economic circle of power who start talking about ending the war, it means that discontent is gradually rising higher. And history has shown time and again, for authoritarian regimes, the hardest times begin when their own inner circle grows weary. But ordinary Russians are also slowly starting to break their silence. According to Russian search statistics, the query, "When will the special military operation end?" set an absolute record for the entire duration of the war. In just 1 week, Russians searched for the answer to this question over 137,000 times. And what's particularly telling is that this surge coincided with two painful problems for the Kremlin: a fuel crisis and a series of large-scale drone attacks on Russian territory. Russians began to feel the war when gas prices rose, when oil depots burned, and when drones increasingly reached Russian regions. Distant events at the front suddenly turned into a completely personal problem. And then, instead of looking for news about the army's latest successes, people start searching for the end date of the war. Other statistics look even more interesting. In Moscow and the surrounding region, the number of searches for bomb shelters has risen sharply. In a year and a half, interest in this topic has more than tripled. It seems that talk of a fully protected Russian sky is increasingly failing to withstand the encounter with reality. But the real leader was the search for UAVs. During the same period, interest in drones in the capital region grew nearly fivefold. And this is perhaps the best illustration of how Russian reality has changed. While drones used to be a topic for military reports, they have now become a part of daily life for millions of Russians. And it seems the Russians will have to get used to this topic, as Kyiv is already openly talking about the start of a new technological phase of the war. While such operations were previously seen as isolated successes, they now increasingly resemble a systematic campaign based on the new capabilities of Ukrainian drone systems. According to Mikhailo Fedorov, it was Ukraine's technological leap that allowed for strikes on military targets and the occupiers' logistics in Crimea. It's no longer just about individual attacks, but about new tools that make it possible to reach targets at a significant distance and gradually destroy the military infrastructure that supports the Russian presence in the occupied territories. The minister made it clear that Ukraine does not intend to stop at what has been achieved. On the contrary, the capabilities for such operations are growing every day, and new technologies allow for increasingly effective actions. And what is particularly unpleasant for the Kremlin is that it's no longer just about occupied Crimea. In fact, Moscow is getting exactly what it tried hardest to avoid. For years, Putin convinced people that war was necessary for Russia's security. But the longer it lasts, the more often Russians search online not for news of victory, but for bomb shelter addresses, drone info, and when it will all end. It seems the war Moscow planned to keep as far as possible from its own people is gradually returning to Russia itself. And the more often drones appear over Russian cities and new price tags at gas stations, the louder the question once considered unwelcome becomes. When will the SVO finally end? The Kremlin has a problem. Scaring people is getting harder because when threats are repeated for years, even the loudest statements gradually lose their effect. The story of the legendary Oreshnik deserves special attention. Until recently, Russian propaganda presented this missile as almost a doomsday weapon. But over time, a strange effect emerged. They keep talking a lot about Oreshnik, but fewer and fewer people understand why they should even be afraid of it.
He already struck with Oreshnik. He's scaring everyone with this Oreshnik.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is betting not on loud threats, but on the consistent buildup of its own capabilities. And while Moscow talks yet again about another superweapon, Ukrainian drones go deeper into the Russian rear, and new tech changes the war's nature. And it seems that's exactly what irritates the Kremlin most today. Because if Putin's maximum bet is made, and Ukraine keeps adapting, strengthening, and finding new solutions, the question is no longer what else can scare the world, but what to do when old methods stop working. Moreover, it seems Russia itself has accelerated the strengthening of the Ukrainian army. More on this next. It seems Moscow has driven itself into a trap of its own ambitions. The war that was supposed to break Ukraine has instead turned it into one of the most combat-ready armies on the continent. The Ukrainian army has not only held out but continues to liberate territories. According to Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, since the start of the year, defense forces have reclaimed over 670 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. And in May, the Ukrainian military was actually able to reclaim more territory than it had lost. And the greatest paradox is that it was Russia that accelerated this strengthening. The Kremlin spent years talking about Ukraine's demilitarization, but the result turned out to be the exact opposite. Ukraine gained modern weaponry, invaluable combat experience, new technologies, and one of the most effective armies in Europe. What was meant to break Ukrainian defense has actually turned into the largest-scale program to strengthen it. Moreover, the war Moscow planned to keep away from its own borders is gradually rolling onto the territory of Russia itself. According to Syrsky, Ukraine's long-range campaign has already seriously impacted the enemy's capabilities. Strikes on military targets, logistics, and the defense industry prevented the occupiers from even reaching planned production volumes of Shaheds. So the factories meant to supply new attacks on Ukraine are increasingly becoming part of the front line themselves. And it seems the Kremlin prefers not to report on this any more than necessary. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine stated that the Russian leadership continues to hide from Putin the loss of certain territories, the isolation of Crimea, and the impact of strikes on military plants. As a result, a country calling itself a superpower is increasingly forced to hide from its own leadership what is happening right under its nose. Despite shifting the economy to a war footing and constantly ramping up weapons production, Moscow has still not achieved the desired result. That is why there is more and more talk about a new wave of mobilization and finding ways out of a situation that has dragged on for so long. And while the Kremlin continues to draw maps of future offensives, the reality looks quite different. The Ukrainian military is not only holding back the enemy, but also gradually reclaiming its land, while simultaneously creating problems for the Russian army far behind the front line. So it turns out symbolically, Moscow wanted to weaken Ukraine, but instead got a stronger Ukrainian army and a war that increasingly makes itself felt on Russian territory. Meanwhile, another impenetrable Russian defense has fallen to the armed forces of Ukraine. While Kremlin propaganda talks about the densest air defense system in the world, the Ukrainian military is increasingly debunking this lie. It is no longer about a single successful strike, but about systematic work to destroy key elements of Russian air defense. According to the Unmanned Systems Forces, operators of the Roni Group regularly disable radars in the Bryansk region that control the sky in the direction of Moscow. In simple terms, the Russian system is losing its eyes exactly where they are needed most. And when radars stop seeing the air situation, even the most expensive air defense systems start to operate less confidently. And it seems that the consequences are already being felt far beyond the borders of the Bryansk region. It is through such gaps in defense that Ukrainian long-range drones are increasingly reaching objects that until recently were considered practically unreachable. St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, Moscow. The list of targets is gradually expanding, and with it, the number of uncomfortable questions for Russian generals is growing.
Breached Russian air defense is not a social media fiction or an accident. When the enemy loses its eyes, the sky opens up for our long-range strikes.
Operation Polyphemus showed that it is not enough to just place radars and air defense systems on a map. If key elements of this system are consistently disabled, corridors appear in the protective shield through which strikes begin to pass. And it seems that closing this gap to Moscow will be much more difficult for the Russian command than explaining its existence on television broadcasts. It is hard to forget another Kremlin nightmare, and its name is Flamingo. Ukrainian missiles are appearing in the sky more and more often, followed a few seconds later by explosions at facilities that were considered securely protected just yesterday. Especially revealing were the shots of the strike on the Titan Barricades military enterprise that appeared online. The video clearly shows not only the flight of the Ukrainian FP-5 missile itself, but also the reaction of a Russian who almost immediately recognizes the outlines of what is approaching. And there's likely more truth in this reaction about the current situation than in dozens of official statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Dad, a Flamingo rocket?
It's not just about a striking image, but about very specific consequences. According to available data, the explosions literally burned out the production facilities from the inside. For a military enterprise, this means much more than just damaged walls or a roof. Production lines, equipment, communications, and the ability to quickly return to normal operations are being destroyed. The plant still exists on the map, but it can no longer operate as it did before. And it seems this is just the beginning, as every new flight of a Ukrainian missile over Russian territory serves as a reminder of the main outcome of this entire story. Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, but instead he got a country of engineers, soldiers, and developers of cutting-edge weapon systems. And now it's these very developments that are increasingly striking places where people were once certain the war would never reach them. Europe is betting on Ukrainian weapons. Volodymyr Zelensky stated that a major breakthrough in the drone deal project between Ukraine and the European Union could occur within the next 6 months. This isn't just about another cooperation program. In fact, it's about the large-scale expansion of Ukrainian drone technologies and interception systems that have already proven their effectiveness in a real war. Essentially, Putin has personally launched a process that is working against him. The longer the war lasts, the more countries become interested in Ukrainian technologies that have been tested not on proving grounds, but in the conditions of Europe's largest armed conflict in decades. At the same time, Kyiv emphasizes that Russia has no intention of stopping on its own. According to Zelensky, Putin wants to continue the war, and therefore must face conditions that make doing so increasingly difficult. That's why Ukraine consistently strikes Russia's military infrastructure and oil facilities while expecting further increased sanctions pressure from its partners. Europe is already moving from discussions to practical solutions. If the drone deal is fully implemented, it will mean more than just a new level of cooperation between Ukraine and the EU. It will mean that Ukrainian drones, interceptors, and defense technologies could become one of the foundations of a new European security system. And it seems this is just the beginning. While Europe is increasingly looking at Ukrainian drone technologies, Ukraine itself is simultaneously launching a large-scale rearmament of its army, ramping up its own production of advanced systems, and receiving ever stronger support from allies. What the Kremlin once called demilitarization is, in practice, turning into a rapid strengthening of the Ukrainian defense industry. And new solutions in air defense, drones, and combat aviation are increasingly resembling the foundation of a new security architecture for not just Ukraine, but all of Europe. All the most interesting details are in the next report, don't miss it. The Ukrainian defense industry is soaring to new heights. Dark times are beginning for Russian Shaheds. While the Kremlin counts how many hundreds more drones can be launched at Ukrainian cities, Ukraine has already shown a next-generation response. The Zirka interceptor drone looks like another step toward the moment when mass attacks will no longer be an effective weapon for Moscow. Speed over 340 kilometers per hour, automatic target detection, and the ability to literally hunt aerial threats. And this is just the beginning. Engineers are already working on Zirka 2.0, which will be able to independently enter the target search area, receive the latest machine vision systems, and even more autonomous guidance. If these plans are implemented on the necessary scale, Russia risks facing a reality where its cheapest tool of terror suddenly stops working. And this means that the entire strategy of exhausting Ukrainian air defense is starting to come apart at the seams. In parallel, Ukraine is demonstrating increasingly ambitious developments that until recently seemed like science fiction. The Moby Dick Sea drone, with a range of 1,400 kilometers, capable of carrying other long-range drones and missile drones, looks like a bid for an entirely new class of weaponry. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about no analogs, the Ukrainian defense sector is increasingly showing developments for which Moscow has no ready answer yet. Moreover, Kyiv reported new agreements with partners to strengthen air defense. Particular attention is also drawn to the fact that this is about cooperation not only with individual countries but about coordination between the United States and European allies.
There are things we can do additionally within the framework of cooperation at the level between the United States and European countries.
This is not about one-time aid, but about creating a new system of interaction between allies. Partners are looking for ways to make Ukrainian air defense even more effective and Russian air attacks even less successful. Ukraine is not just strengthening its air defense. An entire ecosystem of new defense tools and strike capabilities is being formed. And if before this Russia tried to intimidate Ukraine with the number of drones and missiles, now it is unclear whether the Kremlin itself will have enough resources to keep up with the technological race it is already starting to lose. And it seems that this is just the beginning of a major rearmament. Ukraine is officially launching one of the largest Air Force modernization projects in the entire history of independence. An agreement has been signed for the supply of 16 Swedish JAS-39 Gripen E fighters, aircraft that many military experts call some of the most dangerous hunters of the modern sky. And while the Kremlin habitually scares the world with its threats, Europe is effectively helping Ukraine build a next-generation air shield. This is not about a simple replenishment of the aircraft fleet. The Gripen E received a powerful next-generation radar, advanced electronic warfare systems, and Meteor missiles capable of hitting targets at distances of over 100 kilometers. In simple words, it's game over for Russian planes, cruise missiles, and strike drones. And the further it goes, the harder it is to ignore the obvious. Ukraine is no longer just defending itself. Ukraine is building a new architecture for its air defense, where domestic innovation, Western technology, and strategic agreements are starting to work as a single mechanism. And while only yesterday the Kremlin dreamed of air superiority, today it's increasingly forced to think about how to survive in a sky that is rapidly becoming Ukrainian. Meanwhile, as Russian propaganda tries to convince its people that the West is about to tire of Ukraine, Great Britain announces a new support package worth nearly £290 million. And this has long since stopped looking like temporary aid. Since the start of the full-scale war, London has allocated over £21 billion to Ukraine. The amount is so large that Russian TV broadcasts prefer not to mention it at all. During talks in Kyiv, the parties discussed not only the front and preparations for the upcoming NATO summit, but also the consequences of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. And it seems these consequences are becoming increasingly painful. Fuel shortages, logistics problems, and shifting moods within Russian society can no longer be hidden, even behind the usual propaganda facade.
It's important that our partners recognize Ukraine's successes at the front, the results of our middle strikes and deep strikes. We discussed the situation on the battlefield in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, specifically in Crimea and in Russia, the fuel shortage, and the shifting mood of the population.
In fact, we are seeing a new stage of cooperation between Ukraine and its allies. The West is no longer just talking about containing Russia. Instead, we're hearing more frequent assessments of specific Ukrainian successes and concrete decisions on further strengthening our state. And for the Kremlin, this is probably some of the most unpleasant news, because the bet on isolating Ukraine is so far having the exact opposite effect. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your thoughts in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe so you don't miss the top news. See you in the next episode.